Right then, it's been a while since the last video, but we're back! And this time we're tackling the king of aggro, the early game aficionado that is Draven. Draven has been the king of early games since his inception, and a meta mainstay for 90% of Runeterra's lifetime, and, like a fine wine, just got better and better. For most of his time in the spotlight, he remained unchanged, a 3-3 champion with quick attack, pretty good on its own and reason enough to go into a deck, in a similar way as Caitlyn. But what made him a cut above the rest were his spinning axes. 3 burst speed attack buffs that he generated not only on strike, but also when played, made him a value master. Many times players didn't even prioritize his level up, but instead using them to assist in damage to the enemy nexus. Because remember, when you're playing aggro, the face is ace. He was eventually nerfed, but first we've got to go back. Back to a time when Elnuks ran loose and people actually played Hecarim. The release season. For the player base, every card was new, and there were hundreds of varying decks for every champion, which meant obvious synergies reigned supreme. One of those being discard heavy requirement of Draven's spinning axes and Jinx's need to empty your hand were a match made in heaven, and quickly became a staple deck. Now this was early Runeterra, where there were only a few good discard targets for your deck to run, so you always had 3-offs of Jury Rigs and Flame Chompers with crowd favourite acting as the muscle to do some serious damage to the Nexus. This variant also ran the ridiculously overpowered Boom Crew Rookie, who at the time was a 1-4, guaranteeing at least 2 procs of his ability. During Rising Tides, Draven was used as a flexible champion in the mainstay of Pirate aggro, but was eventually phased out by Misfortune as she activated Plunder more reliably with her skill. Draven even got phased out of his own deck, as Championless Burn became the best Noxus aggro deck and the slower mid-range Noxus decks tended to run Darius instead. Thankfully, through nerfs to Legion Rearguard and Boom Crew Rookie in patch 1.2, Noxus decks needed a bit more reach to kill the enemy, and Draven was back in the spotlight. In patch 1.4, Jinx also received a buff to her rocket, meaning the deck was far more effective at closing out matches. Discard in general only got better in the season, with both Sump Dredger and Zornite Urchin becoming easier to use by removing the discard requirement and last breath effect in favour of an immediate draw. Moving towards the next season, everything was set for discard to become the premier deck of the meta. In the third expansion of the Targon release, Cosmic Creations, Victor was released. With the hyper-dominant Gohard and Karina controlled decks nerfed, Draven could rise up again, and with the new burn tool of Ballistic Bot, that's just what he did, but not in a way we were expecting. Sure, discard was still a staple, but nothing had really changed from the classic deck. What I'm talking about was a brand new spell that many thought was a joke at best, but turned out to be meta-defining. Tribeam Improbulator. Paired alongside Ezreal, this deck was a massive removal pile full of 3 mana cards to pump that Tribeam to the precious 6 to 8 mana position and end the game with a massive unit alongside tons of burn. Draven was used as an enabler for the deck, as a good 3-cost unit, and to provide discard through axe generation to either get excited or rummage. And my god was this deck good. With pings of various sizes, tall unit cut down from Flock and Scorched Earth, and the strong units of House Spider and Arachnoid Sentry, this deck could only be strong. The best part about this deck was how it was tailor-made to defeat Aphelios and Nami, the most powerful champions at the time, the moment they were dropped on board. Moving into the release of Shurima, Draven contributed to about 10% of the meta, and apart from Rearguard having his nerf reverted, nothing in particular changed in the best Draven lists. Draven Zoe was played around with utilizing Starry Scamp as an aggro unit, but it didn't pump out enough damage fast enough to contend with the mid-game decks, especially Jarvan and Shen. And the top is where Draven sat for a long time. He was never the highest play rate deck, as Sivir and Blade Dance dominated those spots, but that all changed in the second half of 2021. With the release of Beyond the Bandlewood, 2 champions were introduced to invigorate Draven in his quest for everyone to only play him. Caitlyn, who was replacing the now nerfed Ezreal in Tri-Beam decks, and Sion, whose brand new Noxus discard followers were tailor-made for Draven. To prove how dominant the champ was, take a look at the deck lineup for 2021 World Tournament. Almost every player is running Draven in some capacity, and he was the undisputed hero of the tournament, with Alan using a Tri-Beam deck to claim his crown. After a few months of meta domination, Draven was eventually brought down a peg. On patch 2.18, he lost 1 health, making him a 3-2. Not only was he pingable by many more removal spells, but also died to the majority of challenger units. Despite the nerf, Draven Sion was still a premier unit, as the high-statted fearsome units Noxus had access to were able to dominate the early game. However, the meta started to morph around the deck. Players realised they couldn't let Sion hit boards, so the meta became removal piles, such as Gangplank Twisted Fate, or boards that could go wider and outstat Noxus, like Poppy Z and Turbo Thralls. Eventually, at the beginning of 2022, Sion received a power nerf to all 3 of his forms, massively reducing his ability to end games on the turn he dropped. This nerf was partially reverted in patch 3.6, but the damage was done. The deck fell to tier 3, without the game ender and the early game discard generator, the deck just fell apart. Magical misadventures marked the release of Rumble, bringing with him a slew of Bandle City discard options in the form of Mecha Yordles to push discard into a more mid-game space. Unfortunately, Draven's game plan just didn't seem to synergize with the Mecha Yordle game plan, and as it was too slow to get meaningful units onto the board. Instead, using Rumble's dual region, Draven Rumble would utilize P&Z's Burn and solid early game units to form a strong tier 2 deck. It couldn't keep up with Lulu's Bandle City Swarm or Riven and Victor's Ambush shenanigans, but it could hold its own in the meta. These decks stayed at about a 3% play rate in each rank throughout the rest of the year, as no cards added in the upcoming expansions were useful to Draven. With the release of the World Walker expansions, Rumble even left Draven's side in favour of Vayne to create an OTK deck that was the bane of many players. Finally, in 2023, rotation came. Hundreds of cards were removed from the standard format for being too problematic or too fringe to see play. Among them were Draven and Rumble, and that was the final nail in the coffin. Draven would not be seen in standard tournaments. There was some hope. By getting rotated, Riot thought it fitting to revert the health nerf from a couple of years prior. Now a 3-3 again, he could reclaim his position as one of the best 3-mana units in the game, and that he did. With the start of Glory and Navori, Eternal Ranked had opened up, and it was clear on day 1 Draven was well and truly back alongside his old friend Sion. Alongside the new tools of Crimson Pigeon and Blowback, this deck destroyed the ladder. After a week, the deck had a 57% win rate, which never fell for the rest of the month. In a strange twist of fate, the next Eternal season looks slightly different. Fate's Voyage didn't bring any nerfs to the Glorious Executioner, or even an adjustment to the discard archetype, yet Sion and Jinx were nowhere to be seen. One new card warped Draven from supporting a discard playstyle towards an overwhelm playstyle, that card being Enraged Firespitter. With its huge attack, Kato and Might got a premium unit to pair with. It also does a good amount of damage when played, which helps create a wider board than your opponent. While Fallen Rider was played in this deck, that was usually more for the Rumble than the Draven to utilise his spell shield. That deck was tied for the 3rd most played deck in the world on day 2 of the Eternal Open. Draven is by far one of the most successful champions in the history of the game, always finding himself in the most played decks of a season. With part 2 of Fate's Voyage soon coming, it doesn't look like Draven's getting any additional support alongside Mordekaiser, Morgana or the Elder Dragon, so it's likely in the Eternal season his decks will mostly just remain the same, alongside Rumble, alongside Jinx, and of course Sion.